massive clampdown in China. Police illegally search mobile phones of protesters. Drones snoop from the skies. As anger spikes against President Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy, will the Communist Party crack down on protests? Is this China's Tiananmen 2.0 moment? That's our top focus on India First. Students and other protesters are holding blank A4-size papers as a symbol of protest in China. They want the Chinese President Xi Jinping to change the zero COVID policy. The protests, as our reports will show you, are widespread from Xinjiang in the west to Shanghai in the east, through Beijing, Wuhan, Chengdu and several other parts of China. Are these, as some in Beijing argue, being managed from overseas, or is this spontaneous? Is the volcano bubbling? Has it erupted, or is it waiting to erupt? I'm Gaurav Sawant. We track this big story, we get you more, but first, as always, the headlines. Curtains down on phase 1 of campaigning in Gujarat. The state will cast its first vote on Thursday. Political fireworks erupt over Congress's Mallikarjun Kharge comparing Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Ravan. Massive outrage over Kashmir files criticism by IFI jury. Movie accused of spreading propaganda and being vulgar. Vivek Agnihotri hits back, says terror supporters and genocide deniers can never silence him. Amidst a big Centre versus Supreme Court face-off over the appointment of judges to the Supreme Court, sources say the government has sent back 20 names of judges proposed by the collegium. Andhra Pradesh Chief Minister Jagan Mohan Reddy's sister Y.S. Sharmila detained and arrested during her march to Telangana Chief Minister K. Chandrasekhar Rao's residence. This a day after Sharmila's caravan was allegedly set on fire by TRS workers. Apple threatens Twitter with App Store ban. Elon Musk says he will go to war with Apple. Musk's comments indicate it might stem from Twitter's new moderation policy to safeguard free speech. Police in China and men in white hazmat suits have clashed with protesters in multiple cities as the fire of freedom from COVID restrictions spreads. Protesters, youth, women and in some instances even the elderly have taken to the streets to protest Chinese President Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. Just last month, President Xi Jinping was re-elected for an unprecedented third term. He was seen as virtually unchallenged. But suddenly, as you see in these images, there are thousands on the streets. Both Britain and the United States have reacted to these protests. We bring you our top report. Police in China crack down on protesters as the fire seeking freedom from zero COVID norms spreads to different cities. The Chinese police and men in white hazmat suits stopped students outside the Tsinghua University and other protest sites and scanned their mobile phones for pictures and information about protests. This is a violation of Chinese laws, but the surveillance state is leaving no stone unturned to crack down on protests. The volcano had been bubbling for months, and more than 2 years of intense COVID restrictions erupted after 10 people were killed in an Urumqi high-rise building fire in the rest of Xinjiang province in the west. The protests have ranged from Xinjiang in the west to Shanghai in the east, along Beijing, Wuhan and Chengdu. There are reports of fresh protests being reported from Xi'an in the north. These protests have been described as spontaneous, cutting across ethnic backgrounds. Han Chinese standing in solidarity with the Uyghur Muslims. Students in universities protest from Beijing to Hong Kong. Factory workers out on the streets at the Foxconn iPhone facility. Middle class leading protests in Shanghai. The protests are not restricted now to any one region. In the United States, the White House made it clear it stood for freedom for lawful assembly and peaceful protests.
Our message to peaceful protesters around the world is the same and consistent. People should be allowed the right to assemble and to peacefully protest policies or laws or dictates that they take issue with.
The world is watching closely the protests against the Chinese government's zero COVID policy. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak clarified Britain's policy with China, saying the so-called golden era of relations with China is over.
Instead of listening to their people's protests, the Chinese government has chosen to crack down further, including by assaulting a BBC journalist. The media and our parliamentarians must be able to highlight these issues without sanction, including calling out abuses in Xinjiang and the curtailment of freedom in Hong Kong.
As Britain talks of replacing wishful thinking with robust pragmatism, the world watches China use drones and technology to snoop on its citizens. Undeterred, at least for now, protesters have brought out blank A4 size white papers to register their protests against Chinese President Xi Jinping's COVID policy. Bureau Report, India Today. The crackdown appears to have begun. There was massive police presence at the protest points in Beijing, in Shanghai and several other protest points. But the fire appears to have spread to newer areas, the fire of these protests. The Chinese authorities are saying that hostile forces are behind these protests, making it clear it's important to end the protests here. What does that mean? Joining me on India First, Professor Brahma Chilani, one of the foremost analysts, keeps a hawk eye on China. Colonel Ashok Dini commanded his battalion at the Pangong So. Again, someone who watches China very closely. And joining me from China is Victor Gao, chair and professor at the Suzhou University. Victor Gao was the former interpreter of the former Chinese President Deng Xiaoping. And I want to begin by asking you, Mr. Gao, analysts say that these protests from Xinjiang to Shanghai are spontaneous. Why does the Chinese government believe that this is the work of outside hostile forces?
First of all, it's very rare to have multiple protests happening in many cities in China. It seems that these protests were coordinated by someone. Whether it is domestic forces or international forces, I think an investigation is required. Secondly, for example, where I live in Beijing, on Monday and today on Tuesday, everything is very quiet. I think the protests went away. And I think the government need to address the legitimate concerns expressed in the protests and try to make the zero COVID policies more acceptable to the people and more adapted to the changing circumstances in China. I think it's the same case in Shanghai. You were talking about new protests in several other cities, but I think the focus of the protests have remained the focus on the zero COVID policy. And I truly believe China is in transition between one paradigm to a new paradigm. And I hope whatever differences there are, grievances or complaints will be worked out in an amicable way.
Sure. Professor Chilani, are these regular protests against the policies of Xi Jinping's administration? People are sick and tired of this zero COVID policy, or is this much bigger and more widespread than that is being made out to be?
The repressive lockdowns clearly were the trigger, but the protests have snowballed into something more fundamental and unprecedented. They have become anti-Xi Jinping and anti-Communist Party demonstrations. They have shaken the regime in Beijing. After all, the protesters in Beijing, Shanghai, and elsewhere have been shown on camera bravely chanting slogans like Xi Jinping, leave, leave, and Communist Party, out, out. Even though many protesters have been arrested, and the government is now cracking down on other protesters using facial recognition technology, including mobile data tracking system to arrest other participating protesters. And yet, we have seen these protests continue. This suggests a groundswell of popular support for reversing the Communist Party's increasing repression in China. And it also serves as evidence, if any evidence were needed, that the Xi Jinping-led communist regime retains power, not through popular backing, but through brute force. And the protesters have been mostly young people.
Yes.
And they have openly been demanding democracy and freedom. They have been holding blank sheets of paper, which have become a symbol of protest against repressive policies. And I think the most important message that comes out from these protests is that this is a spontaneous popular uprising against Communist Party rule. This is a watershed moment for China, especially as it comes when China is facing a deepening economic slowdown. It also comes at a time when unfavorable views of China, according to a global survey, are at near historic highs or near historic highs in most advanced economies.
Yeah.
But instead of undertaking a course correction, Xi Jinping's regime has been doubling down on its draconian steps at home and renegade actions internationally. So there is popular anger and frustration.
There's popular anger, there is frustration, but what happens next, Colonel Dini? What do you make of the crackdown that started in a big way? Police scanning mobile phones, and we're showing images. Police just stop students, snatch their mobile phones, scan them, detain protesters, detaining leaders. And is that likely to intensify in the days and weeks ahead?
Gaurav, I would like to, state that I would take a little more cautious approach when we are analyzing the current protest which is happening in China, or the mass group incidents, as the Chinese call these kind of protests which happens. Primarily because, the reasons is many, because first and foremost, the material grievances have always been the source of all kind of protests so far. And in China. And in this case also, the trigger, as was rightly brought out, was because of the zero COVID policy. So it is too premature for us to come to a conclusion that, this protest, of course, I know that there are, names of, or the protests have been, against Xi Jinping and the CCP also, but not to the scale at which it can be called as a mass movement or a revolution, and even to the extent that, like what happened in 1989, the Tiananmen Square. But the reason is because the China dream has been sold very well by the Chinese leaders, and especially by Xi Jinping. And the nationalist feeling exists in China. I don't think that these kind of protests can easily overcome those things. And also we must understand that the Xi Jinping has as a totalitarian ruler. He's got total control of the CCP. He has reaffirmed the ideological orientation of the party.
And yet within a month of that, reaffirming his total control over China, we see these protests. And Victor Gao, Britain says the era of golden relations with China is over. The United States says people have a right to peaceful protest and lawful assembly. Why is China against protests when people say we don't want this zero COVID policy? You're seeing what's happening in Qatar. The whole world is mingling together, and this brutal lockdown in China.
Allow me to emphasize one point. The Chinese constitution protects people's rights to demonstrate and protest, but the demonstration and protests have to be legal. Now, you mentioned the United Kingdom. Imagine anywhere in the United Kingdom, if people just spontaneously walk out onto the street to do protestation, and do you think it will be considered lawful and legal? No. In Britain, if you want to do a demonstration and protest, you need to go through a legal process. You need to get permission from the police to start with. Otherwise, it will not be considered lawful legal protestations. It will be considered illegal. This is the same case in China. People do have grievances. You're talking about 1.4 billion people. Can you expect anyone at any given time to be exactly happy? No. At any given moment, there are people in China who are not happy, who are not relaxed, for example, who may agitate for something else. Now, to the extent it is expressed legally and lawfully, they need to be fully protected by law. Now, when you talk about gatherings of the people, storming buildings, for example, and challenging the authority of the police, etc., this will not be considered legal or lawful by any standard anywhere in the world, including in Washington, including in London, in Frankfurt, you name it.
But
So,
which
let's
other
be
country
honest.
would lock up
Let's
people
call
for
a spade
100
a
days?
spade.
Which other country would lock up its people in 100 days? At times, according to reports, without food and water or medicines, living in perhaps the most inhuman conditions. And I will come back to you on this point, sir.
Allow me to emphasize one point.
Go on,
Allow
sir.
me to emphasize one point.
Go on, sir.
In all objectivity, China has achieved the highest success in terms of preventing the people from dying from the COVID, getting infections from the COVID. Be honest, period. Comparing China with any other country.
Okay.
In the United States, more than 1 million people died because of the COVID pandemic. In your country, in India, I'm very sorry to say, how many people perished because of infections? In China, through our collective work, we managed to achieve the lowest rate of death.
But sir,
the
are your
lowest
figures
rate
actually,
of
with
infections
due respect,
up to
are your
today.
figures actually true? Buildings with so many bodies caught fire is what reports seem to say. You don't permit people inside your country. There is no transparency in China. So we'll have to go by your word or leaks, Professor Chilani. Because when President Xi Jinping was re-elected for an unprecedented third term, he looked virtually unchallenged. But within a month, you have students on the streets, you have factory workers, you have the middle class out on the streets. Is this, in your view, either the Jasmine Revolution moment or a Tiananmen 2.0 moment for China?
Gaurav, any authoritarian regime, because it's a top-down system, looks strong and stable while the going is good. But once discontent spreads and snowballs into a mass movement, then that very regime begins to look very weak. In China, what we have under Xi Jinping is a techno-authoritarian state whose soaring budget for internal security has overtaken the country's massive military budget. China is the second largest defense spender in the world after the US. But its internal security budget officially has overtaken the country's total defense budget. Which other country spends more money on internal security than on defense? China is the only important country where the internal security budget is greater than the national defense budget. And it underscores one fact, that China has an increasingly repressive internal machinery aided by an Orwellian surveillance system.
Yes.
This is what is promoting, stoking the protests. It's encouraging the students and other young people to protest. They may be protesting. The trigger may have been the zero COVID approach of Xi's regime, but they are fundamentally protesting the increasing repression. And there is irony to all this, because given the fact that this COVID virus began in China, then it spread to the world, it's ironical that this virus has now come back to haunt Xi Jinping's regime. And the double irony is that the Chinese regime refuses to come clean on the virus's origins.
And they're building quarantine centers for 90,000 people in every city or in many big cities. What does this indicate? Is the worst yet to come for China? What does it mean for the world? I'll come to that point in just a moment. But Colonel Dinny, is this like a domino effect? The first domino has fallen. Will this actually become China's Jasmine Revolution moment? Or it's a very powerful state. It's permitting people to let off steam just a bit, and then technology will take over and lock them up once again.
I think, Gaurav, what you said, the second, I think I go by that, it's a powerful state with a huge technological backup, including the credit system, the social credit system, and AI and big data, and you name it, everything is there. But what I would definitely say is that in 1989, there was no direct attack on the leadership.
Yes.
But this time there has been, calls against Xi, which again could be because we all know that there are factions within CCP and there are people who want him out and there are people who are not happy with him coming for the third term. And what will happen is, rather than a mass movement from below, because as you said, it's a strong state, what I perceive is as days go by and as he goes into his third tenure, there are chances of this becoming a reason or a trigger for people within the CCP, the people who are not happy. At the moment, he is powerful, yes, but he is growing old by the day. He will face challenges by the day. I think something can happen within the CCP, and for that, probably, yes, these kind of protests can be a trigger.
It can be a trigger. Victor Gao, last 30 seconds that I have on this part of the show. Emperor Xi is what Xi Jinping is being called now in his third term. But uneasy lies the head that wears the crown at this stage. Is it a domino effect? The first domino has fallen. Protests will only intensify in the days and weeks ahead.
First of all, allow me to emphasize, there is no emperor in China by any stretch of the imagination. And China is more united than any other country in the world of today. Now, anyone who fantasizes that China will have a revolution will be doomed to failure. Why? Let me tell you, if we as a nation have learned anything from 1989, it is this: China cannot have a revolution. Whatever problems there are in China, we need to work out the problem in peace, in negotiation, by engaging with each other, rather than plunging into chaos or anarchy. This will never happen in China. Let me assure you. Go back to your sleep, and tomorrow when you wake up, the sun still rises in the east. The sky will not collapse.
Fair enough. We will continue to track developments on this story very, very closely. You say that China will never have a revolution, but will protests intensify? Will there be peaceful negotiation between the government, or will protesters be locked up? We'll track that story. To all my guests, many thanks for joining me. A quick break. Business Today with Abha Bakaya up next. Stay with us.